Welcome to Behind the Opinion. In this segment, we hope to get a little more context for our regulars, and today joining us, we have Nick.
Hello, Josh.
So, Nick, why don't we go ahead and get right into it? Why don't you tell me the first game you can recall playing, and how exactly did that affect your enthusiasm?
The first game I ever remember playing was Super Mario Brothers on the original Nintendo when I was probably about 3 years old, I want to say, 3 or 4. And with that, I remember something about it just really, really clicking with me, where I felt this urge to succeed at that task. I mean, everyone has that experience with Super Mario Brothers when you played it when you're really little, where you're just running straight into the Goomba as hard as you can. And I remember, like, my parents trying to explain to me, no, you gotta jump before. Nope, you're trying to press the button as you're running into it. You gotta press the button before. And then that confusion where I'm jumping and then landing right in front of the Goomba. And then the success of, well, I overshot the Goomba, so I'm not dead. And one thing I really appreciate from a design perspective there is after you're past the Goomba, then if nothing else, you got the little flashing block that you can go ahead and hit for a coin. So even if you've just passed the skill curve of don't die at the Goomba, you are at least rewarded with, woo, got a coin. So that was something where it was just really important to me to get past. I think one of those things with that is being at that small age. I mean, you're used to seeing moving images on TV with cartoons or whatever stuff your parents put on for you. But with the Nintendo, then it was, I am controlling the movements on the TV. And that was something that was huge. The competitive side of things of, have to get past, have to be good at video games, that went away over time. But that sense of kind of wanting to see what's going to, where the screen's going to scroll next, what's going to be on the other side if I move forward in the game, that's still something that excites me.
I know that first Mario game, I know that I've seen videos of some of our friends posting online. The kids have the exact same running straight into the Goomba thing. And that is something, actually, that at some point I would love to highlight how those early games did a great job of easing us into the design, because we didn't have, and it's not because they lack the ability. I remember seeing some of these little guides that were enormous, but they built the tutorials right into the gameplay without being textual. And that was a really interesting approach, especially for being young like we were.
I know that's not a common design methodology today, and I'm really curious if it's something where the complexity really prevents that, or if it's just something where it kind of becomes easier to just be like, press X and press X again to do a hook shot.
So on that note, what would you say your favorite genre of game is, since you're no longer as competitive with needing to just complete it, and why is that your favorite genre?
Well, I think I've struggled with this question. I still absolutely love platformers, and I think why I really like those is those are generally a little bit more positive and cheerful. I mean, obviously we have counterexamples like Limbo or Braid that don't really fall into that thing. But life is one of those things that has a lot of stress with it, and to me, a platformer game is something that gives you an overall ambiance and a challenge, which is kind of more fun and playful. It's a good way to just kind of decompress and not deal with any of the stress of life or any worries or anything like that. And then the other one that I really love are RPGs, and that kind of goes back to that thing about, well, what's on the other side of the screen? What will I see if I keep scrolling? I really enjoy that exploration, and as kind of an added bonus with RPGs, a lot of those usually pull from mythology in interesting ways, or at least attempt to tell stories, where even if they're telling stories in really stupid ways with stock characters, that in and of itself can also be enjoyable.
Now, something you brought up here that I found to be really interesting was the exploration aspect of the RPG. Now, one thing I know that I've noticed you do is in games like Fallout, or that's the biggest example that comes to mind. When you're playing it, you're like, yeah, I'm 30 hours in and I'm just now at this section of the map. It's fascinating to me how you pour over the entire landscape. And do you find that's just something in any game? I know you played the Dragon Age series, and did that have a similar pull to you as Fallout?
Well, I think with Dragon Age Inquisition that there's a fair comparison to be made there in terms of having that open world thing. And yes, absolutely to that one for going ahead and doing the exploration. The older Dragon Age, you had some exploration, but I think it was a little bit more linear. And I'd say that that's something where it's I enjoy that aspect really of any game. I think for me that really goes back to just those older computer RPGs and games like that of just kind of pouring over, and the random surprise of whenever you find some NPC who has something he wanted to talk with you about and what the motivations were for what you were doing, or just or the goofy situation that you'd find yourself in when you just experiment and just stumble upon something.
And I really like you brought up the older RPGs and exploration, because one of the things that I felt that they did much better before I'm going to go with the word exploitation of achievements, is you didn't feel driven to tie your accomplishments in the game to something that was an arbitrary list. So, for example, Fallout, there's an achievement for getting 40-something locations. Well, there's like 100. And the drive there, in my opinion, and I'd like to hear your side of this, should be they created a world interesting enough, you just want to go find the other stuff.
Right, and I kind of think of older RPGs as kind of representing a different design, where you talk to an NPC and they would give you they give you a text explanation about who you need to find, where you need to find them, and that would be one of those things that, you know, they might put it in a little text log as like a little clue to you for your exploration, but it would still be on you to go ahead and eventually connect those two dots together. I kind of see the achievement side of things as tying into the design of things like Fallout 4 and a lot of our modern RPGs. It's the thing that everyone's lambasted of, the checkpoint culture of, all right, you need to go talk to this person, and here's this bright, shiny beacon over their head. They're 1,000 meters away. Go find them. Get at it, sport. And I think that games can still be enjoyable while they have that, but I understand the criticism where it starts to almost feel like it's just you're pressing a button and checking a box. It's the old criticism of games like World of Warcraft of being kind of a Skinner box. You can kind of make that same argument about these kind of games where as you progress further in the game, it's more difficult to get that achievement or trophy or to go ahead and achieve that latest challenge. But at the end of the day, it's still, you're going to go over here, you're going to talk to this person, you're going to press X, drink as many health potions, lower the difficulty down to casual mode, do whatever you need to do to beat this enemy, and call it a day.
I am, because of the way you described that, looking forward so much to you playing Breath of the Wild, because the way that they approach that, I think you're going to eat up. Just the way you're talking about this, and especially if you want to go purist, you can turn off every heads-up display except for your life meter. So everything, just the hearts. But we'll get back to that when you do get around to it. So for the third question, what would you say that your favorite game is, and why is that your favorite game?
This was a tough one for me, but I think I would pick the Quest for Glory series. It's a retro pick. So with that, it was kind of a fusion of genres, and I really feel like they nailed a balance of it perfectly with being an RPG, an action game, and an adventure game. And admittedly, the action game part was mainly when you'd enter into one-on-one combat, and you could go ahead and dodge enemies. You could do like an overhand attack or a lower kind of attack. The RPG side of things, and as you were moving around in this world and even doing mundane adventure game interactions, you'd build up your strength or your stamina or any of these different abilities, and that would affect, one, whether or not you could solve certain puzzles, like trying to move a heavy enough object. Well, you're a warrior. Have you increased your strength enough? But it would also then affect the combat as far as how much your stats will affect your abilities in combat as well, like how much damage you're dealing. So you have the skill-based thing and from the action thing for whether you're dodging appropriately or landing your attacks, but you also will affect how much damage you're dealing based on whether or not you've improved those stats. And I mentioned the example of pushing an anvil. If you're a warrior and if you have enough strength, that kind of gets into the adventure game thing, and where you had different classes as well. So you could be a warrior, a magic user, or a thief. So if you have a challenge, then you might be that you have to cast a spell, and you have to have found that spell within the game to go ahead and achieve it. Or it might be that you're a warrior and you need to go ahead and just brute force your way through. Or in the thief's case, maybe you need to enlist someone's help. Maybe you've networked with the Thieves Guild by using the thief sign, and now you have some sort of cohort that you can go ahead and make use of to do it. It was something that it was obviously limited to the era in which these games really thrived, late 80s through the mid 1990s. The last one came out in 1997. But it was still something where I thought everything came together perfectly. The added perk with that as well was the pulled from mythology, so that each game pulled from its own culture for the scenarios and the environment design behind it. First game was Western European, second was Arabian, third was Egyptian, was both kind of ancient Egyptian and then also just kind of tribal African. Fourth one was Eastern European, and then the fifth was Grecian. One last, I guess, note as well with that is that it had a really unique sense of humor, and it kind of introduced me to the concept of non-standard game overs. One great example is in the third game. Then it starts off and you're in a savanna area in the world map. When nighttime comes around, your character needs to rest, otherwise their stats decrease. So you go ahead and you light a campfire, try and drive away monsters, and you fall asleep for the night. Well, in the morning, do you remember to extinguish your campfire or not? If you don't, then you get a reminder from a little elephant dressed up basically in a Smokey the Bear kind of hat telling you that you burned down the savannah and now you're dead.
What?
Just kidding. This didn't actually happen. But remember, kids, only you can prevent grass fires.
Awesome.
And then it lets you continue along.
That's pretty great.
Another example is in the first game, if you're a thief, then you go ahead and you use a lockpick on your nose to go ahead and clear out your sinuses, but also improve your lockpicking skill. Where if your skill at lockpicking sucks too much, there's a random chance that you're going to poke yourself in the brain and you're just going to be dead. Trying to think. The other great example would be doing hallucinogenics in a pharmacy. In Quest for Glory 3, there's this pharmacy, and this guy's basically got this pipe that you can smoke out of, and the screen starts flashing with all these crazy colors. If you do that 3 times in a row, you get a non-standard game over that tells you that you've become a deadbeat drug addict, and that instead of trying to quell the invasion of demons that you were warned about and that you journeyed to this land to prevent, you spend the rest of your days on the streets of this ancient Egyptian style city begging for money for your next hit. It's a great...
Winners don't do drugs.
You're right. And that's just the humor side of things, because that's the thing, is that you had these main story modes, and then you also had a lot of really compelling side stories. Like in Quest for Glory 4 on the Eastern European side, you had the Rusalka. So you come upon this lake, and there's this beautiful woman, and this was one of their mid-1990s game where you had good illustration. So you see this beautiful buxom woman with hairs covering her breasts, and she's inviting you to come play in the water, come play in the water. You're such a beautiful man. And if you step into the water, she drags you down and drowns you. There's a specialty class called a paladin that you can be, that any of your classes can go ahead and become. Mm-hmm. And the paladin has the ability to basically investigate what happened to this woman, how did she die, avenge her spirit, and then grant her avenge her by killing the wraith that was her lover who drowned her, and then also bring peace to her. So in the final scene where you bring peace to her, then you've gotten rid of the ghost of her angry lover who murdered her, and you go, and she is now no longer a beautiful woman. She is basically a waterlogged zombie corpse, worms crawling out of her and everything. And you have to go. Your character has to walk into the water, embrace her, kiss her, and then she basically dissipates, and you brought peace to her spirit. And you had a lot of poignant scenes like that written into the story that really were meaningful to me.
I could see how that would be pretty significant, but is that what you would consider your most significant game memory?
Oh, my most significant game memory, I think for that one, then I can't really ever get past EverQuest. Mm-hmm. And that was a MMO that came out in 1999. I played it when I was probably about 11 or 12, in just the scale of that open world. So we talked about the open world games and really enjoying that sense of exploration. EverQuest, with the way the difficulty was set, the nature of the difficulty for that game, I still remember zone names that I never personally got a chance to explore.
Wow.
Where I really wish I could go back there and play it again. And obviously, it wouldn't be the same. A lot of the design was basically kind of a treadmill kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But that kind of sense of there's something where if you keep playing, you can explore and see this new land. That's very exciting to me. And it still keeps me kind of half-heartedly interested in MMOs, with that realization that I don't have time for that genre. It was a brutal experience. You could die and lose levels. You died when you zoned into a train of mobs because dungeons weren't instant, so you'd have people fighting deep in the dungeon, try and run away so that they didn't die and lose a level, and you basically just zone in and get murdered right there on the spot. It took a while to run between the different zones. That sense of scale for the game world was much different than any of the newer MMOs that I've played. And with that, then you could be then getting bound to a specific location so that if you died, you were resurrected in that area was difficult. So you could go ahead and be trying to travel to a new area so that you could get a fresh start, die halfway there, and then you need to go, retrieve your corpse, because your corpse has all of your weapon and gear that you need to fight and do basic things like that. I don't know, man. The sense of community there was really real because the structure of the gameplay drove social interactions. You had to talk to someone else to get bound to a location.
Really?
People would have different buffs that would go ahead and do things like enhance your run speed. So it was pretty common. It was one of the early kind of internet meme jokes was "So please," SOW space PLZ, because it was basically requesting a spirit of wolf from another character. Some people would just spam so, because that would increase your run speed, and it was one of the few ways to make it quicker to get from one area to another, and also enable you to outrun mobs. But as annoying as these kind of things sound, that was the stuff that kind of got people out of their little bubbles and talking to each other. You could kind of think of it as almost like the mixer event kind of thing, the icebreaker question that people are being asked. As well, that was a really significant memory for me because with that age that I was at, it really drove home the connectivity of the internet. I remember joining a guild for the first time and seeing someone else using King's English at putting a U in the spelling of words like color or honor or things like that. And I found out that's just the nature of English for the United Kingdom. There's a bunch of stuff like that that just had never really clicked for me before.
That makes sense. And one thing that I always found fascinating, and you told me about this, and it amazes me that you have significant positive memories, was doesn't your equipment degrade on your corpse if you leave it there?
Yes, so your corpse can be lost, and in that case, you lose all of the gear that was on your corpse. I believe it was a 24 to 48 hour period to get the corpse, but there were a lot of unwelcome kind of design things that caused a lot of stress for players and were the kind of thing that. But on the other hand, that was how they gave it consequence. It made the possibility of losing a level and losing several hours of progress, or the case of full on losing your corpse and all of your gear. That gave a sense of consequence so that you had actual stakes for the engagement you were in. That kind of, you have modern MMOs get criticized as theme park MMOs, where it's basically just kind of like you're on the ride to enjoy the lore of this game of World of Warcraft, or enjoy the lore of Final Fantasy XIV. And you have challenge modes for these stuff. It's not like there aren't any sort of challenges that can be accomplished in these games on like the Savage mode for Final Fantasy XIV, or whatever the difficult raid tier is for World of Warcraft. But you don't have any permanent stakes. If you lose a lot of your gear, or if you've just lost several hours of time because you lost the level, that is an actual impact to your character's advancement in this world.
Makes sense. So, completely unrelated to all of that, you'd mentioned the difference between the old MMOs and the new MMOs, and that's one of the things that represents shifting cultures and ideas, perhaps to be more casual. But this is what I want to know, is what is your hope for the future of gaming?
My pie-in-the-sky hope for the future of gaming is that between digital distribution and the expansion of development tools with lower barriers to entry means you'll have more people with creative ideas exploring and having that ability to create new and unique experiences. There are trade-offs to this. I mean, Unity is one of those things that a lot of people kind of deride now. People talk about, oh yeah, it looks like a game that was made in Unity. But on the other, I would rather have people going ahead and playing around with Unity, put a game out there, and if it looks like garbage or if it sucks, that's okay. This person is exploring an idea. Hopefully they learn something from it, and hopefully over time it's good stuff. It's the same kind of idea as far as music goes. And well, do you wish less people had guitars just because it means that you have people putting out crappy music, or are you okay with having a lot of crappy music and then eventually you have some really amazing songs come out of it? And I point to that case of people putting out a bad Unity game as an example, because I think about the remix scene from the video game remix community, and a lot of those people, when they first got started off, got rejected from locations like OC Remix because their stuff just wasn't up to snuff. They got feedback from other people about how to get better, and then eventually they were the people who are now judging the new generation of remixers. And that's something I think would be great to go ahead and see. So that's kind of my personal hope. Outside of that, this is more of a trend that kind of interests me. I feel like you're seeing more games get developed with support from studios in emerging markets. The most prominent example I can think of there would be Might and Magic 10. The graphics were done entirely by a Ubisoft subsidiary in China. However, the main gameplay design was done by a smaller German team. So I'm kind of curious, just as a way to go ahead and cut costs, so that you have a retro dungeon, a retro old school RPG, or at least an attempt at one. And a lot of people didn't necessarily love it per se, but for me, it was kind of a throwback to that older style of games that I enjoyed. My hope is that with these lower cost development environments, and you'll have that ability to explore more stuff like that. And also over time, it might just be interesting to see, well, what does a game made by people from China necessarily look like? And throw in any other country you want. What does a game made by people in South Africa about nearby Rhodesia in the 1970s conflict that gave way to Zimbabwe look like? There's a lot of cultures and a lot of history, mythology, and things that can be put into a gameplay experience that we haven't even begun to see explore. And I think that's because things like the conflict that gave rise to Zimbabwe is just kind of trivial history to us. We didn't live through it. We weren't people. We're not from that region. We didn't grow up in that era when you would read about it in newspapers in the 1970s. It's one of those things that's just kind of a detail about world history of, well, why is Mugabe a thing?
Makes sense. Those 2 points tie together very well. I know that a few games that we've talked about on here, specifically Lisa was made with RPG Maker, I believe, and some games we haven't discussed on the show before, but I know we've both played, like To the Moon. That was made with RPG Maker. And another game that I won't get into in any depth, but Doki Doki Literature Club, a game that's been getting a lot of notoriety online, was made because there was an accessibility to a certain visual novel creator. So I would agree that there are places where we're starting to see the fruits of those labors, and it is fascinating. And I believe you actually had...
Well, and that's the thing, is like you talk about that RPG Maker example, and that's where you have a little bit more of a mature product that's been out there for long enough to see these actual successful games spawn out of that by small-time people. I think that Unity is still in its early enough of a stage that you can kind of think about it sort of like how RPG Maker may have been 10 years ago, let's say. I know it's significant enough as far as the amount of shovelware that's been put out there that the CEO from the company that makes it, John Riccitiello, the guy who used to head at EA, he's made the comment kind of saying, this is just kind of the stakes of getting these tools out in front of people. If I have to have 1 million people with Unity and with that 900,000 of those games being bad games, I'll take that if it means we get 100,000 good to amazing games.
And I would completely and totally agree with that. Another thing that you had mentioned was the emerging market games. I didn't want to cut into what you were saying at the time, but had I ever mentioned the game Stasis to you before?
I don't think so.
So it is a point-and-click adventure game. Before you get your hopes up, it's a horror game, like violent horror game. But it was made by a South African developer, and he has another game coming out. The name currently eludes me that was a Kickstarter for it, but it has to do with alien. It's kind of like District 9 in that aliens land in South Africa, but it also involves robots, and you see it looks like they're building up the conflict from a very different perspective than one that we see. So I'll try to find that name for you, just because it sounds like something that, based on these comments, you might be very interested in.
Yeah, that does sound exciting to me. I mean, going back to our previous conversation about games like Vandal Hearts, where you're talking about exploring World War I in a setting that's not explored very often, think about a game that explores the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, one that's created by Spaniards. That would be really interesting to me, to see developers exploring their own history and culture in the games that they make.
And on top of that, in addition to having a unique perspective on local events for them, I also think you see games like, I know you haven't played it, I believe, but Teslagrad. Games that do fantasy from a different perspective than we're used to. Rain Games, and I believe there's some other Swedish developers that they're really coming out with strong showings. And these different perspectives on established genres are really fascinating to see and speak strongly to your point. But as we come to the end of this, you were one of the first guests I ever had on this show. You had a huge amount of enthusiasm for this project, and your support has been greatly appreciated. But why do you enjoy talking about games?
I think the main reason I like talking about games is because they generate a lot of emotions, and you'll have those emotions at a specific scene. But then at the end of the day, once you finish a 20-hour, 10-hour, however long it is game, you just sort of have an overall impression of how everything came together: the gameplay, the music, the environment, the aesthetics, all of that. And there's a lot that's packed into there. So talking about video games and how you felt about them is a good way to, just like how talking about your feelings is a great way to understand your emotions, talking about a game is a great way to process that experience as a whole and talk about what worked and what didn't work. Understand what you like about that game and what other games you might like based on those preferences you have.
And when you share that kind of enjoyment, or just talk about it in general, you might find that something that really jumped out at you that seemed seemingly insignificant is something that really resonated with other people as well. I know there is a particular scene in the game Pyre. When you get to it near the end, I sincerely hope you see it. And if you do, that's something I want to discuss with people, because it's one of those moments, like you said, where you're like, wow, that was awesome. And it's not associated with an achievement. You're like, that was a very gratifying conclusion. But anyways, do you have anything else you'd like to add before we go ahead and wrap this up?
No, thank you for involving me in this project, Josh.
Absolutely. I really appreciate having you on. And until next time, this has been Behind the Opinion with Nick.